Welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning how to write fantastic fiction. I'm Alton Gansky, the co-host, and the real host, my son Aaron Gansky, is still making his way up from Southern California to Central California, where we are. His car broke down in Bakersfield, and it's my belief that the chances of an auto breakdown while traveling is directly proportional to the number of kids you have in your car. Since he has three, he was doomed from the start. But they have it fixed. Fortunately, they were in Bakersfield, and they're on their way up, but they're not going to be here in time to torment the rest of us. So I imagine I'll get a little updates as time goes on. So for those of you new to the broadcast, I'm Alton Gansky. I'm the Aaron Gansky's father. I'm the co-host here for First in Fiction, and we have a couple of people with us, and they're going to introduce themselves right now.
Hi, I'm Molly. I am the producer of First in Fiction podcast. I am the social media ninja for Aaron Gansky and hopefully soon for Al. And I do all around social media and marketing, and I'm also an author.
I'm Stephanie. Oh, sorry.
He just needs more to do.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Stephanie. I'm sorry.
Molly's got a lot going on. I love the way that you describe yourself as a social ninja, by the way.
Thanks.
Well, I'm Stephanie Carroll. I'm the author of historical fiction novel A White Room, and I am really excited and happy to be here with you guys today.
Now, Stephanie, you were with us before, a few weeks back, weren't you?
Yes, I was on a couple of weeks back and had a really good time then. We talked about, it's slipping my mind all of a sudden.
Historical stuff.
Yeah, it was fantastic, whatever it was.
Memorable too, I can see that. Oh my, yeah. Well, at least we're getting rain here in California, which we desperately need.
Send a little bit our way.
Yeah,
Just
it's probably moving down your way. We need it desperately. Unfortunately, it sometimes creates a little havoc. I'm noticing my video image, and I've got fiber optics and all of that, but it's still a little washed out. So who knows? You don't need to see me any clearer anyway. Well, let me say this. Let me a reminder to those of you who are listening to the audio only. You can see us live every Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. California time, 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. Or if you can't make it at that time, like you're on the East Coast and it's getting a little late, you can catch the recorded version of the video on YouTube, or you can scoot over to aarongansky.com, all one word, aarongansky.com. And the videos are also posted there. So if listening's just not enough for you, why, we can invite you to those places to see what we look like, and then you can watch us make all our mistakes and play them over and over again if you would like. So. We also have this offer. Aaron would make this if he were here. A free audible.com code for his book, The Bargain, his first novel. And the way to get that free code is to submit a question to ask the authors, and I believe that's at his website, altongansky.com. Is that right?
At aarongansky.com.
Yeah. Don't send it to altongansky.com, because I'll have no idea what you're doing. aarongansky.com. I'm trying to fill his shoes, and now I'm.
This is great. We're talking about mentally unstable characters, and you're doing a whole split personality thing.
You can watch me descend into madness here as I'm trying to pull all of this together.
Anyway,
if you'd like to get a code for a free Audible book, submit a question to ask the author at aarongansky.com, A-A-R-O-N, Gansky.com. And we'll be handing those out, Aaron will, when he gets up here or when he gets back home, so we can make those available to you. And it's also my job to do the term of the day, the publishing writing term of the day. And this one also came from Aaron. He suggested this, and it's called RUE, R-U-E. Either of you ever heard of that? It's actually R period, U period, E period. You have?
Well, not if it's abbreviated. I've heard of RUE, but I've not heard of R-U-E.
You rue the day you came on this program. Yeah. No,
yes, but I won't say that out loud, so don't tell anyone, okay?
It stands for resist the urge to explain. Writers have a tendency to want to explain everything because they don't think their readers will understand what they're doing, so they like to explain everything, and they stop the story to explain all these different things. They used to be done a lot in the 1800s. It's considered bad form now. RUE, resist the urge to explain. Let the action explain it. Let some dialogue explain it. Explain only what you have to, but you don't have to explain everything. The readers will fill in, and what you end up with if you don't resist the urge to explain is a very bloated book. And since you're not paid by the word anymore, you probably don't want to do that. So RUE, resist the urge to explain. And one other bit of business before we get into the content, the body of the podcast tonight, and that is this. We do have an Ask the Author question. It's from my buddy Bruce Brady, all the way out on the East Coast in one of the Carolinas, South Carolina, I believe. And he asks this question: can you recommend a novel that is also a good example of third-person, deep point of view? And Aaron did answer that. He said, yes, Remember Me Like This by Brett Anthony Johnson. Brett Anthony Johnson and Remember Me Like This. And I can't go much further than that because I've not read that book. What I can do is explain a little bit about the terms. I never like to assume everybody knows the terms we use. So if you already know this, just bear with me. Hearing it again doesn't hurt much. Third person, of course. Help me out, folks, here. First person is what?
Me, myself, and I.
Yeah. Yeah. I did this. I went there. Think Sue Grafton's novels. You know, A is for Alibi, and I think she's all the way up through Z now. But it's all first person, which of course is very close. Second person is?
You.
You, yeah. You do this, and you did this, and you felt this. Very few people write that way. I don't recommend it. It's very hard to read. But third person is?
They, them.
He, she.
He,
Yeah.
she.
He, she, it. And that's what most novels are written in. First person is normally, mysteries are done in first person quite a bit. Some suspense novels, but most novels are done in third person. POV is?
Point of view.
Point of view, and that's what the pair of eyes you're seeing through. It's a character's point of view. Deep point of view means you get right into the character. You don't have this elevated, sometimes called a God point of view, where you're describing everything to the reader. You're letting the character experience such things. So, thank you, Bruce, for submitting that, and I'm sure Aaron will get you that code soon, if he hasn't already, to get a free download of an audible.com book, The Bargain. Alrighty, boy. Phew, I need to take a break now. That was a lot of talking. Stephanie, it's good to have you back on the program.
It's fabulous to be back. Thank you guys so much for inviting me again.
It's not flooding down your way, right? You're down in by the Air Force Base?
By the Navy base.
Navy base, that's right.
Yeah, in Lemoore. And it's not flooding yet. It's pretty windy, though. A lot of howling going on outside of my house right now.
Well, we'll take that if we get some decent rain out of it and some snow in the mountains, which we need. All right, well, our topic today is an interesting one. We're going to be talking about mental illness, describing characters who are going through emotional and mental illness. And it's my belief that most writers just really relate to this, not from their character's point of view, but just because they're writers. They know a little bit about. Are
you saying we're mental?
I would never say that. I might because you're a few hundred miles away, so I might get away with it. But
great.
And that's often a part of writing, but we certainly relate to it in one way or another. So let me begin with this very basic question, Stephanie. What is your experience with writing characters with mental illness? Well,
my novel, A White Room, is about a turn-of-the-century woman who is struggling with mental illness. It's written with a kind of a perspective, though, of how Victorians viewed mental illness, so not so much as how we do today. But if you were to look at it from how we do today, she would have been suffering from psychosis, which would have been spurred on by depression, anxiety, and severe stress.
Now, I think that's an interesting twist, because when I first saw this subject, I just assumed something contemporary. but mental illness was looked at very differently, 100 years ago.
Yes.
And so you're writing from not a present understanding of mental illness, but from what would have happened then. Are we seeing it through the character's eyes?
Yes, I love that you just described a point of view, because I can say that it is a first-person point of view, and it is all experienced through her experience. So, in a sense, the reader is kind of going crazy with the main character, and it's all experienced through Victorian lens. So we are, as the readers, experiencing how they saw a mental illness like this, how they experienced a mental illness like this, what they thought about it, how they thought it affected them, cures, treatment, all of that.
Okay, now, but what did you base this on? Since you're doing the 18th century, and I can tell from the video that you're not old enough to have been back there with me in the 1800s, not the 18th century, the 19th century.
Yeah, 19.
Yeah, 19th century, the 1800s. Did something trigger this idea, and how did you come to this idea that you wanted to deal with mental illness in that era?
Well, my inspiration for the novel is a short story that was written at the time called The Yellow Wallpaper. It was written by a feminist named Charlotte Perkins Gilman in 1890, and it describes basically a very close experience of mental illness at this time. And basically in the turn of the century, they didn't understand mental illness the way that we do. They didn't have terms like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. They didn't know what any of that was.
Okay, go ahead, Stephanie. You hung up there for a bit, so rewind just a little bit.
Okay. I just said that the Victorians didn't really understand mental illness the way that we do today. They didn't have an understanding of specific conditions like depression or schizophrenia or anxiety, any of that. What they had was a very new field. Psychology had just come around, and there was pretty much a catch-all diagnosis for women in particular called hysteria. And women could be diagnosed for having symptoms that we know of as being signs of mental illness, such as, signs of depression, signs of anxiety, bipolar disorder, all of that. But then they could also be diagnosed for other symptoms, including physical complaints. And this stems from the idea, hysteria was kind of a diagnosis that began back in Greece, and it was about the female reproductive organs. And the idea by the turn of the century was that the female reproductive organs could actually affect the brain. And so it was called hysteria, and some of the cures range from simple, like diet and exercise, to extreme, like the rest cure, the water cure, and the treatment that we've come to know as a hysterectomy, which is the removal of the female reproductive organs, which they believe to be the cause of the illness.
So one of the solutions might actually be surgery, to remove the uterus, because that was the cause?
That was the idea. That was that they believed that the uterus could somehow affect the brain, because everything inside the body was still very new at the time. They didn't understand how everything worked exactly. And this probably stemmed obviously from the Greek understanding, and it stemmed probably from women having a correlation between mood swings and reproductive issues, pregnancy, monthly events.
Nice gentle way of saying that.
That's so delicate.
A lousy interviewer at this point would press. Well, what do you mean? I think we have it. Go ahead.
Well, the story that I was mentioning a minute ago, The Yellow Wallpaper, is about a woman who is experiencing symptoms of what we would know today as being depression or possibly postpartum depression. And she was diagnosed with hysteria, and the doctor decided that she needed the rest cure. And the rest cure is bed rest, but with kind of a big twist. It was basically stimulus deprivation. And this came from the idea that overstimulation could cause a hysterical episode. And women weren't supposed to, if they were undergoing this treatment, they weren't supposed to have any stimulation of the mind or of the body. So they were on bed rest, but then they were also not allowed to do anything that might stimulate the mind. No reading, no writing, no entertainment of any sort. They weren't even supposed to really hold an in-depth conversation. And they weren't, I mean, this went to the extent of they weren't even supposed to eat like flavorful food. They were given bland food during this time. Yes, and it could last for weeks or months. And if anybody's been on bed rest before, because they had a broken leg or something like that, they would attest to it can drive you crazy after a while. And that is exactly what happens in the story. The character who's undergoing the treatment is slowly driven insane by just not being allowed to do anything. And she starts to hallucinate that the yellow wallpaper in her room is moving and coming to life. And eventually she sees a woman trapped behind it. And she is, at the end of the story, pretty much driven completely mad. Later, Charlotte Perkins Gilman came out and said that she wrote the story to expose the realities of treatments like the rest cure and other treatments for hysteria. So even though women were undergoing this, some of them were very aware that there was problems with these treatments and problems with the diagnoses, but because of their status at the turn of the century, they couldn't always do anything about it, because if somebody's saying you're crazy and you're saying this is making me worse, they're just going to keep saying, no, you're crazy. You need to do more of the rest cure. And so that is the story my novel is inspired by, and my novel takes a similar course. I have a character who is suffering from depression and anxiety and some other stressors, and she is diagnosed with hysteria and given the rest cure and is slowly driven insane. I expanded on the yellow wallpaper aspect, and in my novel, my character believes that her Victorian house and furniture are what is coming to life and plotting against her.
Stephanie, that's creepy. And I
yes,
love it.
It is.
I love it. I'd be very careful of furniture if it starts moving around. So yours is also set back in that time, since
Yes.
in that short story served as a basis for you. Now, I think this is a fascinating approach that you've taken, because you're writing for contemporary readers, 21st century readers, who are now looking back into the 1800s and seeing how mental illness was treated and experiencing it through your character, because you're doing it in first person. So they're experiencing mental illness and the treatment, but from something that occurred many decades, 100 years before or something, before today. And did you find that a big challenge to do, to make sure your reader understands what's going on back then?
Believe it or not, it really wasn't too difficult to make sure that my modern reader can relate to the character. A lot of the yellow wallpaper, when you read through it, a lot of women who read through it relate to the experiences that this woman goes through in her mind, of being doubted and of doubting yourself and of not knowing sure what's happening, if something's right or wrong, what to do about it, whether to fight or not. All these kind of insecurities and experiences are very much like what modern women experience, and this is probably because mental illness was, the things that happen in your mind are the same things that happened back then. The doubt, the obsession, the fear, the paranoia, all of those things were there. And if you read the yellow wallpaper, it's very surprising how almost modern it reads. A lot of people are surprised when they find out it was written at the turn of the century.
Mm-hmm.
In your writing of this, was it your goal to get people to feel sorry for your protagonist? Or are they going to be a little creeped out by your protagonist?
Probably both.
I mean, her furniture moves, right? So
yeah, her furniture moves. I wrote it very intentionally so that readers aren't even 100% sure if the character is going insane. I wanted people to kind of go through this experience with her, so much so that they really don't know for sure if it's really happening or not, just as she doesn't know for sure if it's really happening or not.
Sure.
And that's kind of the same feel that you get in the yellow wallpaper. even though The Yellow Wallpaper was a feminist work that was meant to expose the truth of hysterical treatments or hysteria treatments, it's also considered one of the classic Gothic pieces of fiction. And so there's almost a feeling of a ghost story. And there is still historians who debate whether or not the writer was intending it to be kind of like a ghost story or not, if she's really going insane or if there's really a ghost in the house. And that's sort of the same experience that I wanted to create in A White Room.
Hmm. I think it's a great topic because it allows you to, I started to say, manipulate the reader.
Yes.
And maybe that's really what you're doing. Because as you're saying, they don't really know if this person has mental problems, or maybe she really does. That you feel sorry for, but then maybe you need to be a little creeped out because mental illness can be frightening.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've done something else here when you, especially this type of mental illness that we're talking about here. Everyone gets depressed.
Yes.
For writers, royalty statements come out twice a year, so there's at least, 2 times a year when writers across the world get depressed with that. We all get depressed, so I think there's going to be a connection, and maybe this is what you were trying for, a connection that since I've been depressed at times, maybe not for long, but nonetheless I know a little bit about it, I can relate to the character.
Yes, exactly. I wanted readers to kind of have that experience of seeing that they're not the only one that feels this way sometimes, and that even if they do feel, weak and helpless at times, that they're not, that they can be strong and come out of it and make changes in their lives and completely reinvent themselves if they need to, and if they're willing to fight for themselves. And so yeah, and I'm so happy that so many readers do tell me that they know how she felt, that they have felt the exact same way. I've had people say, "You wrote this book about me. How did you do this?" And yeah, and that was one of my goals, definitely.
So you have spies.
In the mind.
It's easy. I just have a few spies and some video in your house.
I have to go offline now because you guys are really creeping me out.
So now we move from depression to paranoia.
Yeah.
And as I've been fond of saying, is just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Sometimes paranoia can be a good thing when properly used. Now, this is the kind of story, though, Stephanie, this is the kind of story that could be very literary, or it could be very popular. And by popular, I mean for the masses, general market kind of thing, not so much a literary tone. Which one have you picked on this? Are you striking a literary tone, or are you aiming for the masses?
I'm going definitely for upmarket, so a combination of the two. It has very literary topics. There's a lot of symbolism and a lot of things to think about, a lot of levels, different layers in here, but it's written with pretty simple language. It's not there's not as much of a focus on language when it comes to, literary fiction. Sometimes they say that there's more focus on language than there is on plot or characterization. I think the best ones have a focus on everything, and that's my intention. I try to do a great job with the language, but at the same time keeping it simple and easy to read and easy to relate to. And I mimicked also the language in The Yellow Wallpaper, which is another reason why so many people say they are surprised when they find out it was written at the turn of the century, because it reads very with simple language. It's not the flowery kind of 1800s language that a lot of people think of when they think of that type of fiction, like Wuthering Heights or Dickens. It's a very type of writing where anybody can read it, basically.
Ah, that's great. So is there something that's we'd call maybe the most important thing to remember when you're writing a point of view from a crazy, I hate to use that phrase here, but that was a rundown there, from a crazy character. Now, I've written some crazy characters. Some of my antagonists were just plain nutty. And I showed it through their actions that they had some real problem, and then I would develop why they had that problem. It's one of my things that I think your protagonist should have some background. Your antagonist should have some background, too, so we know why. the person is cruel or why the person is violent or um, lives in a cave and avoids people. There's needs to be some reason behind that. But so in doing what you're doing, did you have to keep anything special in mind from writing from a first person point of view of somebody who's suffering from depression in an era when they don't really have a definition for that, understanding of that?
Well, for me, I kind of wanted to have some fun with it and have the reader kind of have some fun with it. But one of the really important things was the kind of incorporating my own feelings of sometimes feeling crazy in there, because we all feel crazy sometimes, and that was what really made the character relatable. But in addition to that, I would say also keeping your reader keeping your reader interested. Some people might think that if you're writing a crazy character, that they have to, that they're going to be so crazy that it's going to bother the reader, and that that's something you have to do, or that's something that's inevitable. And I would say no to that. That if you're not keeping your reader, then you're not doing your job. That's the most important thing.
We could probably say that we're all a little crazy from time to time. If you stay in the writing business long enough, you'll definitely qualify because you start talking to your characters. And I love to tell the story as I saw one of my characters once at a restaurant.
Really?
Yeah, stunned me. I couldn't talk because my part of my brain was going, well, there's Gates, and the other part of my brain's going, you're an idiot. No, look, to the T, you're still an idiot. The person, there was a person who looked exactly as I imagined my character to be, and it was really.
That is insane.
Yeah, pretty much put
Excuse
me
my
there.
pun.
So I thought I'd lost it there for a minute, but because the person's a doctor, but she was taking orders at a steakhouse, and I couldn't figure out why she was doing that and what had happened, and my brain started to fabricate the story behind her, and then I came to from there. So fortunately, I was rescued. I had people with me. A lot of major characters have quirks that might be considered some kind of a mental aberration, emotional aberration that makes them what they are. And it can be a good thing or a bad thing. So, for example, Sherlock Holmes was a drug addict. So he's brilliant in every way, but he's a drug addict. And that's his weakness. And then I was thinking about Isaac Newton. A lot of people don't realize this, but Isaac Newton, though a real person, as great as he was, genius that he was, probably had Asperger's syndrome. And that's why he was as great as he was. He displayed those kinds of symptoms. So he had perhaps what would be classified today a mental disorder. I'm not sure what the proper terms would be by psychologists today, but he had issues, which made him great, but made him pretty much a loner. People didn't like to hang around with him because they couldn't understand him. So now you taking this character, where we're starting to feel the character's emotions, the frustration, I imagine, of not being able to do anything because she's a woman in this era. She doesn't have that kind of authority or even a right to an opinion, I would guess, and which I think is the reason why the short story was written.
Mm-hmm.
So you're taking us back in time to what, at least in this instance, is a worse time and helping us experience all of that. So now as you're writing, are you feeling it? Did you feel the frustration and the emotion?
Oh, definitely. One of the reasons I was drawn to this topic was because I experienced similar feelings in my own way, in my own modern way of feeling, feeling trapped, feeling required to do something, feeling obligated to my husband or to my duties as a woman in general. And a lot of those feelings went into that. And it's funny because my book is inspired partially by the yellow wallpaper, but it's also partially inspired by my experience as a military wife. I was required to pick up and move to wherever my husband was required to go, and if that was a small town where I wasn't going to be able to get work, then that was what it was. And if I didn't like where we ended up moving to, we couldn't leave. And and the first time I experienced that as a young woman, I had just gotten out of college, and I had never had a real job before, other than, you know, like fast food work or something. And I was ready to work, and we were moved to a very, very small, isolated town in Fallon, Nevada. And that feeling of being, you know, obligated, but then at the same time wanting to support my husband and fulfill the things that I wanted to do for him, but then at the same time be my own person and pursue my goals. It gets very complicated sometimes, and so a lot of those feelings went into the story, and a lot of those feelings are kind of also mirrored in the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, and so that was one of the reasons that I sort of felt a connection there.
Yeah. Yeah, and military wives go through a ton. When I was doing work with Major Jeffrey Struker, I did a series of books with him, and one of the key requirements for me to be his collaborator was it was fine to show the soldiers in the field, but I had to spend a good bit of the book showing the families at home. And so there was always two plot lines. So what the guys were going through on whatever mission they were on, and it's what the families were going through while they were going on those missions.
Yes.
And it's that could be your third book. You could write about somebody
I
like
forgot.
you.
I forgot to mention in the beginning when I introduced myself that I actually write a blog for called Unhinged and Empowered for military wives and military girlfriends, and that's kind of the concept behind it, is that at times we might feel crazy and we might feel weak and we might feel helpless, but we can embrace that and embrace what we're doing and embrace who we are and still become empowered.
Hmm. So is that one of the goals of your book here when you're dealing with this subject, is to help other people feel empowered in their situation?
Yes, yes, it is. I wanted modern day women to get to experience not only this experience of being at the turn of the century and going through this, but then also be able to take those feelings and emotions and relate it to their own lives and their times when they felt crazy, times when they felt weak, times when they felt like they couldn't get out of a situation, and then use this and find empowerment through it. That is definitely one of my goals and one of the things that I hope my book does for other women.
Hmm. Well, what are the most common mental illnesses in people, and how do they manifest themselves? The illness, that is, not the people. How do they manifest themselves in the people?
Well, I don't know 100% exactly what the most common mental illnesses are. I might be able to find it with a Google search, but for me, I think the more important thing is what readers think the most common mental illnesses are, the ones that we hear about the most, depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, those types of things I think are what readers are often interested in. And I think those are the ones that readers often wonder if they themselves are suffering from. Like, oh, is this a symptom of anxiety? Is this a symptom of depression? And they're constantly asking themselves if they are, in fact, having a symptom of mental illness. And so I think those are kind of more important when you think of it in that sense. But then again, it's also important to think about the mental illnesses that aren't very well known, because those are really interesting and intriguing to readers too. I was doing research before the podcast, and I found some pretty interesting ones. There was 2 articles. There's an Alternet's 12 Quirky Mental Disorders You Haven't Heard About, and Listserv 10 Most Bizarre Psychological Disorders. And they had some really, really neat things. One of them that just kind of stuck out to me was micropsia. And that's also known as Alice in Wonderland syndrome, because people who suffer from it will see things as being much, much smaller than they really are.
Huh.
I thought that was so fascinating. I've never heard of that before. It's probably very rare, but I'm sure it would be very interesting in a character.
Oh, it would be. It'd be fascinating.
Yeah. One that I thought was really cool, when I read it, I was like, oh, that would be an amazing book, is something called and this is French, so I might butcher it, folie à deux. And it is a delusion where multiple people will start to show symptoms of a mental illness that one person who they are around a lot has. And this says that a very common one that people experience is schizophrenia. So maybe a family lives in a house with somebody who has schizophrenia, and family members start to show symptoms
Mm.
of that disease. And I think that might actually be one of the theories behind the Salem witch trials. Don't quote me on it, but I believe I've heard a couple podcasts on the Salem witch trials, and I think one of the theories is that one person had an actual experience of psychosis, and then the other girls started to mimic it as sort of a mass hysteria kind of experience.
Huh. I've heard of men who have felt pregnant when their wives are pregnant.
Yes, that's
Um,
probably the same thing.
yeah, adopt the disorder that's around them. Boy, that'd be hard to do if you were a doctor, huh?
No, yeah.
As you're talking about this reminds me of that some of the best characters in television and in books have been people that have had disorders they've had to overcome uh, to either for their own sake or for someone else's. And for some reason, the television show Monk, because you mentioned OCD, obsessive
Yes.
uh, compulsive disorder, and he had a horrible case of that, but he could still function. He
Mm-hmm.
wanted to lock himself away, but life would not allow him to do that, and that made him all the braver
Yes.
and all the smarter and all the more lovable. But it made him pitiful because you always felt bad for him having to deal with all of this. And I think that's be one of the things I would add is that one of the mistakes that new writers make is they make their heroes plastic. They don't have any warts. They don't have any problems. They don't have any challenges. Um, and the illustration I often use is Clive Cussler, who I enjoy quite a bit, but his earliest books, and he's still learning at that point, his main character, Dirk Pitt, is just kind of plastic hero. He's just hard to believe. Interestingly enough, his sidekick, Al Gordino, is very real. Well, as the books progress, the protagonist becomes more complicated, he grows, and it's because the author is growing in all of that. But it is one of the mistakes we make is our heroes are just too good to believe. So I've always thought you should either ugly them up or beat them up or hamstring them a little. You got to give them a few bruises. There's got to be something that just isn't quite working for them, and they have to deal with it. And so I've used physical disorders, sorrow, events in their life, and it's affected them emotionally.
Those do that does definitely make the best, most interesting characters, the ones you want to read about.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm noticing on our rundown sheet, and I think Aaron I don't know if you put this up here or Aaron did, but how do we write from the point of view of a crazy character, there's that word again, without losing the reader? That is how do we give enough information for the reader to be grounded in reality when the character isn't grounded in reality?
So I was looking at this question earlier, and I realized that it's kind of two questions, or at least I sort of have two answers for it. The first part is, how do we write from a point of view character without losing the reader? And to that, I have a couple of answers, and one of them, the first one is relatability. I think if your readers can relate to the character, then they are going to stay a little bit more. They're not going to get lost. They're not going to believe, oh, this isn't realistic. This isn't something that would really happen. If they can relate, they're going to believe it. But then, you have those disorders that we talked about that are a little bit out there that people aren't going to be able to relate to. And at the same time, you can still keep a reader intrigued in the story and believing the character if you keep it interesting, if you keep the story moving along, if you make that character, have problems, if you make the plot have a hook, all of those important things with a story, as long as you keep the reader interested in reading, they're gonna stick it. They're gonna stick it out. The second part of that question is, the grounding them in reality, and that part really has to do with what type of fiction you're writing, because some fiction, when it comes to characters with mental illnesses, is very grounded in reality. Like there was a movie a couple years ago, or maybe more than that, called Girl Interrupted, with Angelina Jolie and Winona Ryder, and that was a very realistic look at people suffering from mental illnesses and having to go into a mental institution. But then you have something like the book Choke by Chuck Palahniuk, and it's not so grounded in reality. It's not so realistic. And it's not something you can really relate to. It's about a character who has a sex addiction, and the things that he does in this book are so outrageous and so just unbelievable, but we believe it and we keep reading it because of the way that it's presented by the author, because the character is intriguing, the character is humorous, and we feel sympathetic for him, and we want to know what happens in his story. So it just kind of depends on how you're approaching it, and that goes for a lot of things when it comes to writing somebody with a mental illness, is how you're approaching it and what the tone of the actual book is.
Boy, the time's starting to get away from us, so we need to maybe just limit ourselves to a couple more questions and then see what's coming from the room, kind of questions they have. But how do you demonstrate the progress of the illness? Seldom does a mental illness just jump on someone and stay that way. It usually, or often does anyway, progresses. How do you demonstrate that? Or if they get better in the process, how do you demonstrate that?
That's something that I think really depends on genre. If you have a thriller novel, or there's a thriller movie called Black Swan that's actually about somebody struggling with a mental illness, and the way that it's presented is not the same that you have it presented in a movie like It's a Kind of a Funny Story, which was a movie and also a novel by Ned Vizzini, or books like Choke or Fight Club, also written by Chuck Palahniuk. They're all presented differently, how people start to experience the mental illness and then how they recover from it. And again, the type and tone of the book depends on whether or not the characters even are aware of the fact that they are struggling with a mental illness. And that really plays a big part in how you present it, is whether or not they know it and whether or not they're willing to face it and try to overcome it. Like you said in the show Monk, he kind of faces his fears a little bit and tries to be capable of doing things in society. He gets out there and he does it anyways. But then there's stories like The Girl Interrupted, where she's a little bit hesitant about trying to get better, about trying to overcome her circumstances. So those all play a factor. I think a really great way to know how to do it is to study the actual diseases, study the actual mental illnesses, find out how they realistically progress, how they realistically are recovered from, and to, of course, study other authors and study other movies that do what you want to do, and then try to see how you can use that and do something similar or something new.
Well, there's certainly a lot of material that could be used for novels on this type of topic. Aaron reminded me when I was on the phone with him a little while ago that he's working on a book that takes place in a mental institution, and so he's having to deal with some of these things. So he's very interested in seeing how you have done it and maybe learning from that. And then I think about, and I think you may have mentioned this here, I'm just not seeing it in the notes right now, A Beautiful Mind.
Yes, that's a fantastic movie. It's about a man who's a real man named John Nash, and he figured out a very important and fantastical mathematical formula. I'm terrible at math, so I can't really explain that part. But he suffered from, I believe it was schizophrenia, or he believed that he knew people, he interacted with people who it turned out weren't real, they weren't there. And he's a very sympathetic character. His progression throughout the film, he starts out as kind of a very, off-putting person, but then we witness him warming up to people. We witness his heart growing as he forms friendships, as he forms a love interest, and we see him trying to do the right thing, even though he's kind of a strange, weird person. And when we do discover that he's not, these people that he's talking to aren't real, and he tries to overcome it, and he submits to painful and unpleasant treatments, and that just makes us even more sympathetic to him, and it's a really, really fantastic example of a film that follows somebody with a mental illness. It's a very good one. I highly recommend it for somebody who's writing this kind of a character.
Now, the room can correct me if I'm wrong about this, because it's been a long time since I've seen the movie, but at the end, he gets a Nobel Prize, and
Hmm.
a man comes up to tell him that, and he's standing in the hallway just outside his classroom, and the man's telling him, "You've won the Nobel Prize," and one of the students walks out, and he asks her, "Is he real? Is there really
Yes.
somebody here?" Because
Yes.
he couldn't tell. And I thought, man, what a great line, what a great little scene,
Mhm.
to show that this man
Yes.
has achieved so much, but still isn't quite sure uh, if he's really won the Nobel Prize. So, and boy, there've been a lot of those. Another one that's mentioned is James Bond is, and I just saw the most recent movie, and listing him as somebody who's having some kind of mental or emotional disorder, because such a
Hmm.
womanizer and violent and whatever else might be going on. So some think that perhaps he's showing some kinds of problems like that.
There was an article in the National that talked about James Bond,
Mm.
how if you look at him from a psychological standpoint, he is a serial killer. He's
Oh,
sadistic, he's narcissistic, he's a misogynist, like he's a terrible person, but he's one of the most all-time loved characters, and that really goes to show how an author presents a character with mental instability can really turn things and manipulate things to create an interesting story. And I mean, you could take the same exact character or a similar character and approach it from a different perspective and have somebody that readers, are not sympathetic of. The character from Misery, Annie Wilkes, who kidnaps
mhm.
a writer and then keeps him hostage and abuses him and does terrible things to him. And then of course one of the mentally unstable characters that freaks me out to this day is I can't remember his name right now. It's Bateman, I think, but the character from American Psycho. Uh,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Sadistic serial killer and murderer. Very, very disturbing movie about a character that is one that, like James Bond, in many ways, but we do not like him the way that we like James Bond because he doesn't have any redeeming qualities the way that James Bond does. James Bond has that article talked about how he has patriotic duty. He has, he takes down villains, and he even does have self-control to some extent when it comes to who he kills. And he has the occasional redeeming moment. In the newer movies, he has a love interest that he loses, and we feel for him when he loses her because she betrays him, and things of that sort. So it really just, you can take a character suffering with almost any kind of illness and doing all kinds of horrible things or just weird things or things that we relate to because we all fear that we are experiencing them ourselves. And depending on how you approach it, depending on your genre, you can really present it to the reader in a variety of ways. You're not locked into anything.
Wow. All right, for the last thing here, and then we want to hear from Molly about what's going on in the room. Um, and that's some of the techniques you suggest for writing insane characters. And you have a blog post that you wrote some time ago, but it's you
Yes.
freshened it and put it back up. And
Yes, I wrote a blog post in 2013 called "How to Write a Crazy Person's Inner Monologue," and I reposted it on my website, stephaniecarroll.net. And I can't, go into it in too much detail, so if anybody's interested in it, they can check that out. But I can sum it up a little bit. And like I said, this is specifically inner dialogue and inner monologue. And the reason I kind of chose that is, for one, my book is written from a first person point of view, so we experience a lot of her inner monologue, so I had a lot of experience with that. But then also, earlier I mentioned how somebody who's experiencing a mental illness experiences a lot of the same feelings and thoughts at the turn of the century, the same way that we do now. And regardless of the type of mental illness that somebody's struggling with, a lot of the same struggles that go on internally are similar. So you can take the couple of techniques that I'm talking about here and apply them to a variety of different cases and still create what feels like somebody who's struggling inside, having a struggle with their own mind. One of the things that I found very useful was obsessive thoughts, obsessing about details, obsessing about events, obsessing about people. Distracted thoughts, so your character is talking about their job 1 second and the next thing you know they're on a tangent about government conspiracy. Rants, tangents are also another good one. Repetition, in addition to repeating like tics or behaviors, repeating thoughts can really create a sense of insanity, and I personally picked that one up off of Chuck Palahniuk's book, Fight Club. He has this thing that he uses, and they do it in the movie too, where the character reads a book about anatomy where there's a first-person point of view from the perspective of a colon. And the colon is saying, I am Jack's colon. This is what I do. And he pointed this out as being really weird and strange. But then the character takes that, I am Jack, and he applies it to himself throughout the story. I am Jack's, I have a couple quotes I pulled off the internet. I am Jack's complete lack of surprise. I am Jack's wasted life. I am Jack's smirking revenge. And he not only thinks these internally, but then occasionally he'll say it to people, and they'll like look at him like, what? And this created a feeling of him being kind of off balance, a little bit weird. And that's one of my favorite crazy things I've seen. Of course, tone, which we've talked a little bit about already, about how you present things, the way that you present it. Tone is a great way to deal with, to create a sense of insanity. Synesthesia is a really neat technique that is a comparison technique. And this is when you express a sensory experience as being experienced through the wrong sensory receptor. So smelling a taste, or hearing a touch, or feeling a sight, like they don't quite work together, and so you can use that to create a sense of something not clicking quite right in the mind. That's a technique, though, that the writers use all the time for just general comparisons and descriptions. So once again, it's one of those things where it's how you present it. And then one of the ones that I really enjoy is nonsensical metaphors and similes. Using a mixed metaphor or a nonsensical metaphor or simile can really create, again, that sense of things just not being quite right. And it's great for humor if you're trying to incorporate humor into your insane character. But you can also use it to create a sense of creepiness. And I really wanted to give you guys a couple of examples. I didn't find any creepy ones, but I found some funny ones. And this is from an article called 18 Metaphors and Analogies Actually Found in Students' Papers or Not, but they are still hilarious, and it's from Mental Floss. I'll just read a couple because we are running out of time. But just kind of imagine as I read these as if it was coming from an insane person, and how that would kind of portray them to the reader. Okay, here's the first one. His thoughts tumbled in his head, making and breaking alliances like underpants and a dryer without cling-free. Her vocabulary was as bad as, like, whatever.
That's terrible.
She had a deep, throaty, genuine laugh, like that sound a dog makes just before it throws up.
Okay.
Yeah, I may have to use that one.
And this one is my absolute favorite. He was as lame as a duck. Not the metaphorical lame duck either, but a real duck that was actually lame, maybe from stepping on a landmine or something. I love that.
That's great.
Well, yeah, what was the one I saw? The boat moved across the water just like a bowling ball wouldn't.
What?
The boat moved across the water just like a bowling ball wouldn't.
Oh, God.
Everything seizes up as you try to unravel all of that.
They say in a writer's class, don't do that. Don't use bad metaphors. But if you're trying to write somebody who isn't thinking quite right, it has a very good effect.
Yeah.
Molly Joe, do we have questions?
We have a couple of comments and one question.
All right.
Jenny Snow wants to know, Stephanie, she says it's a little off topic, but what did you do to prepare to write in the Victorian era?
Oh, that's a wonderful question.
Mm-hmm.
I did a lot of research. Before I even started writing the book, I researched for 6 months. And I did that because when I sat down to write the book, even though I had a degree in history, I thought I was going to be able to sit down and just start writing, and I realized that my everyday life of people in the Victorian era, and you have to know the things that you experience in everyday life. What do you eat? What do you drink? How do you talk? What do you wear? What do you do when you wake up in the morning? Do you brush your teeth? Or do you get, do they have showers? Do they have electricity? All those little things, you kind of don't realize it unless you really do a lot of research. And there's a lot of great books out there on the Victorian time period. And if you're interested, definitely check out my website. Even send me an email sometime, and I could recommend some great books.
Already you're breaking up there some, Stephanie. Her website is Stephanie Carroll. Stephanie, the traditional spelling. Carroll with 2 R's and 2 L's, and it's .net, not .com, right?
Right.
Okay, .net. Alrighty, Molly, what else do we have?
Conversation through the chat room. Jenny did ask the question, didn't Abraham Lincoln have his wife committed for mental illness for a time? And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, they both had some psychological problems.
Mm-hmm.
If you're president during the Civil War, if you didn't have psychological problems, you certainly would have them at the end. But his wife, certainly had some emotional issues. And she lost 2 children, and at times would blame him for it, and it just got worse for her. And then, of course, he's assassinated, and that really kind of put her around the bend. And he was what they would have called then, and did till just recently, manic depressive. The tendency now, I think, is to use bipolar. Now, I'm not a doctor, so don't quote me on that. Seems like they're switching to that. But manic depressive meaning you're very, very happy and very much able to do things, achieve things, and then depressive, you can't do anything, and you're very, very sad. And it's a roller coaster kind of life, and a lot of people have it. In fact, a lot of creative people have that. It's not unusual for writers to some degree, ride that roller coaster. Same thing with movie directors, others, anybody that's involved in creative activity. They're up and down. Artists, kind of like painters, Van Gogh and others. Had those kinds of things. So yes, it's true that Mary Todd had some issues. And I don't remember if she had been sent to an institution. She may have committed herself. I don't know. We'd have to do a little more research on that. So
I've kind of find it. I'm not sure. I haven't actually ever done any research, but I find it unlikely that she would have. But because mental institutions at that time period were not good or helpful places. They were oftentimes places where you sent people who you didn't really know what to do with anymore. So I would think that somebody of her stature would have private doctors. But then they had other types of places that they might send people with hysteria diagnoses, kind of like retreats. This is the type of thing where people used to go to Bath and take the cure, that type of stuff. So it's hard to say, but I would be surprised if she went to a mental institution. But I could be wrong.
That's interesting. That's interesting information. I want somebody now. One of us needs to write a book about her.
Yeah.
Right?
There's probably been a couple written about her. I can't remember the author now, but I think there is one. But
well, I'm not saying there weren't. I'm just saying one of us needs to do a better one.
Oh, yes, yes.
Maya says in her work in progress, her character's voice changes as she falls apart. She says it's subtle, but when she workshopped it, the voice change was really effective at portraying the loss of reality. I
Wow.
like that. I think that's a neat trick.
Yeah.
That sounds great. That sounds like a
Yeah.
fabulous trick.
There was a science fiction program where a guy woke up and everyone else was speaking a different language, including his family.
Ooh.
Ooh.
And it would just start with a weird term that would be thrown in that wouldn't fit. Is there any milk? Yes, it's in the dinosaur. And they point to the refrigerator. And, of course, you can imagine what your response to that would be. And as time went on, all those terms became more frequent, and he had to learn a new language.
Oh,
Hmm.
wow.
But so you could see all his frustration as it grew because he couldn't understand even his kids anymore. Kind of
Oh my gosh.
interesting story. You have anything else for us, Molly?
One last one from Maya.
Okay.
She says voice rhythm is good too. People are naturally rhythmic, and having a character's verbal rhythms go out of sync can make the reader feel really off. I like that. I think that's powerful.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Or changing subjects mid-sentence, starting one sentence and finishing with a different sentence. It just doesn't match, kind of like what you were talking about with those oddball metaphors and stuff. Yeah, there's a number of those good things. Well, we started a little late, which is good because we're ending a little late, but that's all right. We're not on that tight a clock. Again, I know Aaron wanted to be here. He was really looking forward to this, and we apologize for a little bit of the quality problems we've had tonight because of rain in Central California. So we think that's what the problem is, but it happens enough in the rain to make us think that's what it really is. So next week we're going to have Happy Holidays ? With Kathy Ide. Also, don't forget to run over to aarongansky.com for Ask the Author. You can get that free download audiobook of Aaron's The Bargain, which is a great book, by the way. Don't tell him I said that. My job is
Not at all.
Yeah, my job is to, keep him down, but it's a great book. So you can get that the audio version of that, and I think that translated into audio very well. Alrighty, so let's find out where people can get hold of you. We've mentioned your website a couple times. We'll go ahead and mention it again, Stephanie, if you would, and then any social media that you might like to mention.
Website is stephaniecarroll.net, and pretty much all my social media handles are at Carroll Books. I think my Google Plus is just Stephanie Carroll. And the Military Wife blog that I mentioned earlier is at unhingedandempowered.com. And like I said earlier, if anybody was interested in finding out more resources about researching the Victorian era, they can find that on my website, and they can find my email on my website as well to send me an email, and I'd be happy to share any books I recommend for that type of research.
Alrighty, and producer Molly.
I'm Molly. My blog is franklyMyDearMojo.com. I'm also on Twitter at RealMojo68. I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Google Hangouts. Did I miss anything? I think that about covers it. If you go to my blog, again, like Stephanie, you can find all my links and all the buttons to connect with me there.
Alrighty, and I'm Alton Gansky, and I blog at my Writers Conference, which meets in North Carolina in May. Best way to get there is just the initials, BRMCWC, Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference, BRMCWC.com. And tomorrow, I continue a little series, What Makes Agents Stand Up and Say Wow. Last week I talked about why they say no. This week I talk about what makes them say yes, and the way I did that is I polled a bunch of agents, and they told me what makes them say wow. So it's going to be mostly their words. And then I sometimes also blog over at novelrocket.com, and I do that once a month, and yesterday I had one come out, so novelrocket.com. And I'm on the social media somewhere. You can go to altongansky.com and probably find that stuff. So
you are on Twitter at Alton Gansky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Twitinator, and I get those alerts and the like. Stephanie, it's been great having you on the show. Some very good stuff, and I also want to say very big thank you to our very patient audience and those in the room that contributed questions and comments and the like. You guys are the best, and we all hope you have a great Thanksgiving. So, for now, as Aaron would say, what's he say? Good writing? Great writing?
Good
Good
writing.
Yeah, good writing.